Hello once again, and welcome to the Drydock episode 245, part 2, continuing the Patreon Drydock. Let's get on with questions. Thomas Nelson asks, how would a modern gyro stabilizer affect gunnery in each era of warships, Age of Sail through World War II? What classes of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, etc. would even benefit, and would maneuverability be prohibitively affected? It depends what you mean by a modern gyro stabilizer. Do you mean a modern gyro stabilizer for the guns, or do you mean a modern gyro stabilizer for the ships? Because if it's a gyro stabilizer for the guns, I think that's actually probably going to be more useful, because whilst big guns, battleships and so forth, for the majority of the period where long-range gunnery actually mattered, already had a form of stabilization in some way, shape or form, there are smaller ships which didn't. So having a modern gyro-stabilized gun system, kind of like you see on some tanks, would be quite useful, because that would mean that smaller ships and the secondary and possibly even tertiary batteries of larger ships would become significantly more accurate. You can see some of the attempts they tried to make fully 3D stabilized anti-aircraft mounts for light and medium anti-aircraft guns, and even some of the heavy ones, which, when they worked in World War II, they worked fairly well, but that's a very big when. Quite often they didn't. They would just break down. So that would be quite useful. Obviously, if you go back into the pre-Dreadnought period, there would be some utility in slightly better accuracy, but the bigger problem once you get well into the pre-Dreadnought period is the lack of rangefinders and fire control computers, more so than the stabilization. So it might have helped a little bit, but not as much as you might think. And then, of course, once you get back before that and into sort of early Ironclad and then Age of Sail, well, you don't have the power systems to power a gyro-stabilizing system for the guns, and their inherent inaccuracy and lack of sighting systems means it's probably not too helpful. I mean, you will improve accuracy somewhat, yes, but the investment in resources compared to what you get out of it would be relatively minimal. Now, in terms of the gyro stabilization effect on a ship, as in the whole ship having a stabilization system, that might be more effective. But it depends what ships you're using it in, because the single biggest problem when it comes to shipping and stabilizing the ship for gunnery, as I mentioned, the turrets of the bigger and medium ships tended to have stabilizers already. And when the sea state is getting really bad, if it's really, really, really bad, a gyro stabilization system for the ship will probably be overcome anyway. But if it's just bad trending down to calm, the systems on most of the guns will help regardless. You know, they'll keep track of almost all the things. The two things they can't really account for is the pitch of the ship, fore and aft pitch, because obviously the gun turret is fixed. So let's say it's pointing broadside, all the guns are nicely aligned on the horizon. If the ship pitches down 20 degrees, well, I'm sorry, the guns are now all pitched 20 degrees, and a gyro stabilizer for the ship isn't going to change that. And similarly with the vertical movement of the ship. So the side-to-side roll, that's mostly corrected for by the ship's existing gun stabilizers. But again, smaller ships that couldn't have them would benefit from having their roll periods stabilized and possibly reduced by gyro stabilizing system. So it would help, certainly, from kind of 1900 onwards, when long-range gunnery becomes a thing, especially on smaller ships. And for a little bit before that, it would help increase the accuracy of gunnery, but not by a huge amount. But overall, except for maybe niche cases like destroyers and small cruisers, it's going to have a percentage or maybe a double-digit percentage effect in increasing gunnery, as in, and I don't mean that's turning, let's say, a 4% hit rate into a 15% hit rate. What I mean is you might turn a, let's say, a 4 or 5% hit rate into a 6 to 7% hit rate, which might well be worth it, but it's not going to be aimbot at sea. Slaman Sam asks, had La Argentina been preserved as a museum ship instead of being scrapped, would she have been brought back into service for the Falklands War, and could she have made a difference, perhaps sailing with the General Belgrano or escorting 25 de Mayo? I don't think she would have been able to return to Falklands service that quickly. I mean, if she'd been preserved as a museum ship, given that the Argentine government planned the Falklands War, then I guess there is a possibility, because if they're planning it from the start, then that gives them a longer lead-in time to go, okay, well, we're going to take this ship and put it back into frontline service. So maybe, but the processes involved in making a ship a museum ship as opposed to keeping a ship in reserve would mean that reactivating a museum ship would take significantly longer. And if you look at, say, HMS Tiger, and they, in the Royal Navy, they seriously considered and wanted to get HMS Tiger back into service to help with the Falklands effort, and she was in reserves. She hadn't been, derated to a museum ship, but it wasn't possible to reactivate her in time, even though they were in the process of doing so, or at least looking at whether they could. And admittedly, that's partly because some components of her, while she was in the reserve fleet, were stolen by various other Royal Navy crewmen because they needed those parts for the ships that were going out immediately. But still, it kind of shows, if you've got a ship that's supposedly in ready reserve and a war suddenly breaks out of the length of the Falklands War, you're not getting that thing back online. So a museum ship that's being brought back up to speed at the same time definitely isn't getting back up online. With the caveat, of course, as I said, that if the Argentine government's planning this for several years, then maybe they could, but taking a museum ship out of being a museum ship and starting to reactivate it as a warship might be a bit of a giveaway. Now, as far as the two roles that you mention, escorting 25 de Mayo isn't going to make the blindest bit of difference, to be perfectly honest, because 25 de Mayo sailed out, heard about General Belgrano, and went back home. I mean, that's a very short and crude summation, but realistically, 25 de Mayo herself didn't really contribute all that much to the Falklands War. Her air group did, but not while they were flying off of her. So if La Argentina sails with 25 de Mayo, it really doesn't make much odds. Now, if she's sailing with General Belgrano, with the best will in the world, neither General Belgrano nor her escorts realised that they were being tracked by Conqueror, and La Argentina, for all her superlative capabilities as a World War II period cruiser, does not have the equipment to track a, at the time, modern nuclear attack submarine any more than the other ships present there did. In fact, the other ships present there had been modernised a lot more recently and therefore probably had a better chance of tracking Conqueror, and as I said, failed to do so. So in that case as well, it's probably not going to make all that much difference. In fact, it might make things worse for Argentina, because if, General Belgrano is sunk because she potentially has the possibility of causing serious problems for the Falklands Task Force with her big battery of 6-inch guns, and La Argentina also has a battery of 6-inch guns, admittedly a few less than General Belgrano, but still a potential significant threat, which would mean that she would also be on Conqueror's target list. And given that Conqueror has 6 forward tubes and she fired 3 torpedoes at General Belgrano, it's entirely possible that if Conqueror comes across General Belgrano and La Argentina sailing along, she might drop the other 3 tubes on La Argentina, which, I mean, again, it's not going to manifestly affect the capabilities or lack of capabilities of the Argentine Navy when it comes to the Falklands, because it's pretty much ending up in the same situation. But there would be a huge, huge morale blow to the Argentinians because, well, General Belgrano being sunk is one thing, and that was bad enough, but a ship called La Argentina being sunk by the British in the middle of the Falklands War, that's a little bit more on the nose. I mean, there's a reason why Deutschland was renamed in World War II. Roadrunner Meep Meep asks, Just how effective were the secondary batteries on ships where these secondaries weren't dual purpose? Well, if we look at fast battleships, because that's kind of when the dual purpose versus split secondaries comes in, if we think, well, all the American fast battleships have dual purpose secondaries, the King George V have dual purpose secondaries, so we're eliminating the British and US navies from contention. The Yamatos have a split secondary because they have some, well, as it starts off, they have 4 6.6-inch for their anti-surface secondaries. The Littorios, as you can see here, also have some 6.6 for their anti-surface secondaries, and the Germans, of course, split between 150 and 105 millimeter guns for their secondaries. Now, the French did intend their 152 millimeter battery to be dual purpose. It didn't quite work out, so they had to stick some 100 mils on as well. But I don't think it's really fair to look at the French performance, because a lot of World War II was spent with their fleet either non-operational or kind of neutral, which essentially I think defeats the point, because they don't have much of a chance to explore their combat capabilities. There's a little bit at the beginning and a little bit at the end, but compared to everyone else, that's not really fair. Now, as far as I can tell, the Italian 6-inch secondaries don't seem to have been used all that much, and don't seem to have ever hit anything of any particular note, if at all. The Japanese removed half of the 6-inch secondaries in favour of more 5-inch dual purpose, even if the Japanese 5-inch dual purpose wasn't particularly brilliant, but they still did it, so they preferred, as it turns out, more dual purpose and dedicated anti-air. And to be perfectly honest, I think the main reason they didn't remove the remaining 6.6 was because the arrangement of where they stood was just very inconvenient, and it would have looked a bit silly with a twin 5 on it. You know, you've built these 2 really tall barbettes to have triple superfiring arrangement forward and a standard superfiring aft, albeit with different calibers. I don't know quite how the logistics of replacing a 6.6 all the way up there with a twin 5 would have been, but I don't think it would have been pretty quick or cheap. But nonetheless, again, a Yamato 6-inch, they got a little bit more use, but again, didn't really achieve much of anything. About the closest anybody's dedicated anti-surface secondaries on fast battleships got to achieving anything was Bismarck's, particularly when she was trying to hold off the Tribal class and Piron at night, in the night before she was sunk. And, well, she didn't hit anything. So, apart from slightly worrying some of the destroyers, and I guess maybe keeping them far enough away that the torpedoes they launched seem not to have hit, that seems to be about the highest achievement of the dedicated anti-surface secondaries of the Second World War on fast battleships, which isn't exactly a huge amount of achievement, is it? Now, granted, I'm not necessarily saying that having a couple of extra twin 5s or maybe some twin 100s would have saved Yamato or Musashi from air attack, nor necessarily would replacing the 150s with 105s on Bismarck have saved it from the swordfish attack, although that is entirely more likely, given the sheer number of barrels that would have been present. And, well, sticking a couple of extra 90mm mounts on a Vittorio Veneto probably, again, isn't going to change, or a Littorio isn't going to change all that much either. All that might save Vittorio Veneto from being kneecapped a little bit, possibly. So, you know, weirdly enough, the ship where its anti-surface secondaries had the damning with faint praise greatest impact, that being Bismarck, might also have been the one that would have benefited the most from not having them. Because, as I said, you know, if you have a couple of dozen 105mm barrels instead per side, you might just about not have been hitting the stern by a torpedo. Who knows? Megascro asks, what's a naval history case of, it's a horrendous idea at best, but it seems like fun, and eventually it turns out to somehow not be quite as bad? Arguably, the fire ship. You know, let's review the modern-ish iteration of the fire ship circa the time of the Spanish Armada. It's like, okay, we are outnumbered and outgunned and outmanned. Yes. So you want us to take some of our ships and you want us to set them on fire. Yes. The ships that are made of wood and tar and canvas and rope and have gunpowder on board, and we usually take absolutely ridiculous measures to make sure there isn't fire on board. You want us to put those on fire? Yes. So we're not going to have those ships anymore, correct? They're just going to burn up and possibly explode? Yes. And if it doesn't work, then we're out 4 ships. Yes. Oh, and we're going to need volunteer crews, because no crew in their sane mind is ever going to accept orders to get on board a ship we're intentionally setting on fire, having deliberately made it even more burnable. Well, it generally sounds like a completely horrendous idea. On the other hand, you got to sail a ship that was on fire, or about to be on fire, into the middle of the enemy fleet and watch them scatter because, hey, it's a ship on fire and we don't want to also be on fire. And these kind of shenanigans go on for 100 or so years, 100, 150 years, until fire ships become less of an ad hoc thing and, as you can see here, actually become a purpose-built vessel. And then they've been built at significant expense and they have firepower and they end up being used as small frigates, and actually most purpose-built fire ships either don't get expended or get expended after giving many, many years of useful service. At which point you have the capability if you need it, but you also have a relatively useful light warship, which can serve your navy for years, if not decades, and just can turn around and set fire to an enemy fleet if it absolutely has to. T.C. Pratt asks, supposing Admiral Beatty and Flag Lieutenant Seymour both contracted tuberculosis in 1916 and neither are available for Jutland, who would have made the decision on the selection of Beatty's successor? Who would be the likeliest replacement for Beatty? And, if it wasn't Sturdy replacing Beatty, would the previously brewing Admiralty conflict between Fisher and Beresford have been a factor in denying Sturdy a higher command than a battle squadron? Well, there's an embarrassment of flag officers, even if you just go from Admiral, Rear Admiral and above, let alone Commodores, in the Grand Fleet and Battle Cruiser Fleet around about the time of Jutland. This is obviously a couple of months before Jutland. So, I mean, in immediate terms, absolute immediate terms, Beatty is incapacitated. Who takes over? Well, at that point, it would default to one of the admirals in charge of one of the battle cruiser squadrons. And you've got Rear Admirals Brock, Pakenham and Hood. And of those 3, Brock is by far the junior. Pakenham and Hood were both made Rear Admirals in 1913, Brock only in 1915. So it's probably either going to be Pakenham or Hood taking charge in the short term. Now, in theory, Jellicoe could then nominate another admiral to take overall formal command of the battlecruiser fleet, and that could be implemented relatively soon, but the overall decision would have to be confirmed by the Admiralty eventually. But I'm not sure in the space of a couple of months whether that paperwork would escalate all the way up and then back down again. It might do, considering it's wartime, but who knows. So by the time of Jutland, on a roll of a dice, I'd probably say Hood. I know he's in charge of 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, but at the same time, it's Pakenham is in charge of 2nd. Now, if they are able to bring somebody in relatively quickly from the fleet, theoretically you could bring someone in from outside the Grand Fleet, but let's not complicate things. At the time, you have 4 Vice Admirals, because obviously the 3 Admirals who are commanding the battlecruiser squadrons are Rear Admirals. 5th Battle Squadron is also Rear Admiral Evan Thomas, but in March, that whole thing hasn't happened quite yet. So if we're looking at the Vice Admirals who are present, we've got Vice Admiral Burney, Vice Admiral Madden, Vice Admiral Jerram, and obviously Vice Admiral Sturdy. And of those, Admiral Burney is the most senior, having received his Vice Admiral appointment in 1912, followed by Jerram, who was promoted in early 1913, and then Sturdy in late 1913. Admiral Madden, I think, is probably out of the running, considering he only got his promotion to Vice Admiral the year before, in 1916, in 1915. However, Burney is also second in command of the entire Grand Fleet, so I don't think they'd want to shift him immediately from that position. So that leaves it really between Jerram and Sturdy. Fisher is gone from the Admiralty for about a year at this point, so I don't think that's going to make a huge impact on things. At which point it's kind of a coin toss between what kind of admiral do you want in charge of the battlecruiser fleet. Jerram is a bit more solid and dependable, a bit more reliable. Sturdy, as we've discussed before, is a little bit of a maverick with his tactics. So, given Beatty's style, if the Admiralty is looking for continuity of leadership style, i.e. very forward and aggressive, they'll probably go with Sturdy. And if they want to reel everything back in, then they'll probably put in Jerram. Avoid Shisnos asks, during the development of the P-38 Lightning, there were a lot of problems due to the engines putting out more power than the airframe or control surfaces could handle due to limited understanding of high-speed airflow. Was there ever a ship that experienced similar issues due to limited understanding of fluid dynamics or other issues? A lot of the early torpedo boat destroyers or destroyers that were equipped with turbine engines had this problem. Partly due to the fact they hadn't managed to work out how to introduce geared turbines just yet. But, well, let's just say when they put some fairly high power turbines in, and even some fairly high power vertical triple expansion engines in a bunch of these early, let's call them destroyers, there were multiple issues. There were issues with some of them being so lightly built that the hulls would flex and twist under the torque of the propeller shafts and the power that the engines were putting out. They would also have issues with the hulls being lightly built again, so that if the ships are being slammed through the sea through heavy waves at high speed, the hulls could buckle and twist then, or even break apart in one or two cases. And then you also had the fact that direct drive turbines on destroyers tended to cause massive cavitation issues, which led to a loss of propulsive efficiency, which led to weird things like them sticking 2, 3, or even 4 propellers on a single shaft in an attempt to retain at least some degree of forward momentum. Soren Tomlinson asks, the Yamato class battleship was built with the ability to confront several enemy capital ships simultaneously using its 18.1-inch primary artillery. Nevertheless, have there been any occurrences where battleships employed their main battery to engage multiple enemy vessels simultaneously in real life? There have been a few instances where ships have used their main battery to engage multiple targets. Graf Spee, if you want to use the colloquial pocket battleship appellation, obviously the Battle of River Plate, engaged Exeter with one of her 1111s and Ajax and Achilles with her other 1111. Then you've also got Yamashiro at Surigao Strait possibly engaged with different portions of her main battery on different targets. It also depends how far you go back to determine battleships. I mean, if you go back to pre-dreadnoughts or ironclads or Age of Sail, you can find a lot more examples of ships using different elements of their primary battery to engage different targets. Whereas once you get into the dreadnought era, straight-up dreadnought battles with multiple ships on both sides are relatively few and far between. And when they do occur, they tend to be fairly large. So, for example, at Jutland, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if several ships engaged multiple targets with different elements of their main battery, especially in the places like the Death Rider, the battle cruisers, or some of the night actions. But it's going to be very difficult to prove that without going through the logs and working out sort of minute by minute where each turret was targeting. Lincoln Locker asks, if the rest of the Admiral-class battlecruisers had been completed and retained through the naval treaties in lieu of building the 16-inch armed vessels, how do you think the presence of Hood's sisters affects the modernisation and utilisation of the Queen Elizabeths leading up to and during the war? If we've got the full Admiral class, so 4 of them, in service, I mean, given the displacement, I'd like to see the treaty system that otherwise allows everything else. I mean, okay, if you don't build Nelson and Rodney, that does take a fair bit off, but we're still talking about, well, there's a 4th vessel involved now, and there's the above 35,000 ton nature of the Hoods, so, or the Admirals, I guess. So, I mean, you probably have to ditch a couple of other ships early. Now, to be fair, they do have the Iron Dukes immediately post Washington, so I guess instead of retaining the full class of Iron Dukes, they'd have to get rid of 2 of them. I mean, they had the King George V and the Iron Dukes, but the King George V's were only there until Nelson and Rodney came into service, and then the Iron Dukes go out of service at the end of the 1930s along with Tiger. So you wouldn't have the King George V's being retained for a bit at all, and you may have to ditch 2 of the Iron Dukes early if you want to keep all the 15-inch gunships and Tiger, I guess. So, you know, that's plausible, but when you come to the London Treaty and so forth, assuming that with this extra displacement somehow you finagle it that you don't have to ditch an R-class or 2, because they probably would be the first ones to go, I don't think it's going to massively affect the modernisation of the Queen Elizabeths, because the reason for the Queen Elizabeths being modernised was because they were the oldest ships that were considered worth keeping. The R-class were originally supposed to be replaced by the King George V's. The modernisation of the QEs was supposed to keep them as viable until the Lions could be built to take over from them. As it turned out, that was then changed, so the King George V's were built in addition to the existing fleet, and the R's were then supposed to be replaced by the Lions, which made the retention of modernised QEs even more important pre-war. The only caveat to all that is obviously they pulled Renown, QE, Valiant and Warspite in for renovation. If you have 4 Admiral class, you might see somebody try the modernisation on one of them first. So instead of maybe trying it on Renown, you might try it on Hood, as she'd be the kind of half-sister to the other 3. But yeah, it's not going to affect the modernisation of the QEs all that much. The utilisation's a slightly different matter, because apart from anything, the Royal Navy, assuming they don't have to give up an R or 2, has an additional hull. And even if they don't, they have 4 fast hulls, including possibly 1 modernised. And, I mean, with the Scharnhorsts and the Bismarcks coming online in Germany, they're going to probably want to keep at least 2, possibly more, of the Admirals up in the home fleet until the King George V start coming online to deal with those. But you might then see either a mod. I mean, it depends. If they have modernised Hood, it's different. I mean, if they haven't modernised Hood a la Renown style, they've just updated her with the rest of her sisters, it's probably going to be 2 Admirals in the home fleet, 2 Admirals in the Mediterranean fleet, which probably means one of those Admirals will take the place of Warspite as flagship, and also gives Cunningham a lot more options when it comes to engaging the Italians, who are obviously quite quick. If Hood has been modernised, then it does raise the interesting conundrum of where does she go? I think initially she'd be deployed to the home fleet, but I think as soon as King George V comes online and you've now got a modern fast battleship there, you'll probably get Hood reassigned to the Mediterranean to be a modern fast battleship in there, probably swapping place with whichever of her sisters needs some repairs. So the main impact is going to be the fact that Warspite won't be flagship of the Mediterranean fleet, and Admiral, possibly Hood, will. Andronor asks, whilst the Deutschland class are much maligned ships of the Kriegsmarine, if their speed was increased and they were built in larger numbers instead of the larger battleships, would they have had more effect as a surface raider over the U-boats? I severely doubt it, to be honest, because, well, you've got the original 3, and whether the Kriegsmarine restarts building them or they build what was notionally going to be their successors, it's neither really here nor there. But instead of Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Bismarck and later Tirpitz, there is the matter of yard space as much as anything else. You know, just because, let's say, you could build 3 Deutschlands in terms of displacement compared to a single Scharnhorst, that doesn't mean you have 3 shipyards and 3 sets of machinery and 3 sets of guns and 3 sets of finance capable of doing that. But let's say, for sake of argument, you can build 2.5 Deutschlands for each battleship, because they'll be slightly quicker to build. So even if you use the same slip, you can build the hull, launch it, and start building another one. Plus, it'll cost a little bit less. Plus, you might be able to use other yards, other slipways that are somewhat smaller. So you could get, let's say, 5 Deutschlands or Deutschland successors for the Scharnhorsts, and by the start of the war, let's say you've maybe got another 1 in service as well. So you've got 6, and then the remainder that you're getting instead of Bismarck and Tirpitz is going to be completed during the war, much as Bismarck and Tirpitz themselves were. So you now have 9 Deutschlands or Deutschland equivalents. That's going to be a fairly dangerous surface raiding force, because following the rule of 3s, that means you could theoretically have 3 out in any given time, and when those 3 are coming back in for refit, repair, etc., or possibly lost, you can sortie another 3. Now, that is going to mean, obviously, the Royal Navy is going to be absolutely paranoid about guarding the ways out, because having 3 of these things out at sea on independent missions all at once is not going to be a good thing that they're going to appreciate. So there, I mean, statistically, therefore, there is a higher chance of them being found and sunk, but it is going to mean that there is a lot of Allied activity focused on tracking these things down, perhaps a greater emphasis on anti-surface vessels, i.e., getting the battle cruisers up in shape, potentially building more cruisers, because of course all of this is happening in the 1930s. So if they know that there's a major surface raider threat going on, instead of deciding not to, say, build Surrey and follow on heavy cruisers, they might actually build them, etc., etc., etc. So things diverge a bit. And that might also take the heat off the U-boat somewhat, because if resources are being diverted to build larger ships to counter improved Deutschlands, then perhaps not quite so many resources are being devoted to the Flower class, and so on and so forth. So it might incidentally make the U-boats a bigger threat, because there might be fewer escorts around to deal with them, but ultimately you can build a lot more U-boats and put a lot more U-boats in service a lot faster than you can surface raiders. So ultimately, the U-boat's still going to be the more effective solution, even if it takes a little while for them to catch up. Jellicoe Cats Get Confused at Night asks, the Japanese Navy wasn't shy about substituting wood for steel in warship fixtures and fittings to conserve imported iron ore for more vital purposes. Why did they choose to use linoleum as opposed to wood for decking? Well, Japan's not exactly rich in vast amounts of wood, especially the kind of wood that's suitable for durable decking either. Replacing iron or steel with wood in warship fixtures is more about making sure the ships are lighter after some of the incidents they had near the beginning of the 1930s. When it comes to linoleum, obviously linoleum means they don't have to use large amounts of wood, which is a benefit for them. It's relatively flexible, and it's quite insulative, and it doesn't use vital materials. Linoleum doesn't need oil. Well, it does need oil, but it needs linseed oil. It doesn't need hydrocarbon oil, the kind that they were running fairly short of. And so it's relatively cheap, relatively insulative. If it's made the right way, it's fairly non-skid, fairly grippy, and therefore it's a good substitute for using vast amounts of what's otherwise quite expensive durable hardwoods on your decks. The big downside is that it's incredibly flammable, which many Japanese cruisers would find out to their cost once they were hitting combat. My Mum's Basement Needs More Windows asks, I've just watched Jonathan Parshall's presentation on Midway at the 2011 National World War II Museum International Conference on World War II, presumably sponsored by the Department for Redundancy Department. At one point, he puts up a timeline showing that all 4 Japanese carriers were launching and recovering combat air patrols at various times. Although he doesn't explicitly say so, I've always assumed that all 4 carriers were also contributing aircraft to the various strike forces, and in particular that all 4 were in the middle of rearming their strike aircraft with anti-ship weapons when the fateful American attack occurred. If so, it seems to me that it might have been better from the Japanese standpoint to have dedicated each carrier or pair of carriers to specific roles, such as combat air patrol, or land strike, or naval strike. Is there some reason Nagumo didn't or couldn't do this, or am I wrong about all 4 carriers being particularly vulnerable to attack simultaneously? The idea of dedicating carriers to specific roles does come up time and again. I mean, during HMS Victorious' stint with the Pacific Fleet, along with Saratoga, they actually did essentially turn Saratoga into a strike carrier and Victorious into a fighter carrier. And this concept was also experimented with in a number of fleet problems during the 1930s over in the US. The problem becomes that unless you're operating everybody very, very close together, the strike carrier will be lacking in air cover. And the fighter carrier will have problems marshalling a strike if it detects things, because then if the fighters or recon planes from the fighter carrier have find something, they then have to communicate back to their carrier, which then has to communicate with another carrier in order to get a strike going. And also it runs into issues which US carriers were actually experiencing in 1942, which is if you're trying to launch considerable numbers of strike aircraft from a single carrier, it can take quite a while to get everything airborne. So what you have at Midway is one of the many aspects in which Japanese carrier doctrine is a little bit of a two-edged sword, because Japanese carrier doctrine holds that to form a massed strike, you form up strike elements, fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, etc., on each carrier. Each carrier then launches a portion of its strength, and these all combine to form a massed attack wave. And this is basically what happens at Pearl Harbor, for instance, and what happens on the morning of Midway. It does have some very, very significant advantages. It means that each carrier is left with a reserve of aircraft, so no carrier is left completely undefended. It means that the overall strike can be very large, as long as you are operating multiple carriers at once, but also still be launched very quickly, because if each carrier only needs to launch 2-3 dozen aircraft, it can spot all of those on the deck and have them away within 15 minutes, half an hour, as opposed to US practice where each carrier is launching a good chunk of its entire air wing, and that can take over an hour in some cases. And it means that if there's a need for a follow-up, because obviously you can immediately start spotting the next elements of your strike group or air group, it means that if there's a follow-up attack needed, you can very rapidly sortie off another round of aircraft and then recover your first lot. So if you want to operate multiple carriers together, Japanese carrier doctrine at the start of their involvement in World War II is pretty darn good. And also it means that combat air patrols are all coming off of different carriers. The advantage there is that it means that if your carrier is hit, then there's still other elements of fighters around the fleet. Whereas if you have everything in all the fighters on one carrier, that carrier gets hit, well, now you have no fighters, which isn't particularly brilliant. The flip side of it is, of course, that if your fleet gets caught on the hop and you are suddenly told, right, we need to switch from anti-ground to anti-ship strike, everyone has to do that. And if everyone is doing that, then yes, there is a risk that everybody gets hit in that window, which to a certain degree is kind of what happened at Midway. But no tactic is completely flawless. Everything has an advantage and a disadvantage. Generally speaking, the Japanese carrier air wing doctrine was pretty sound, but it did have a few vulnerabilities, one of which was the one that was very heavily exploited by the US at Midway. US carrier doctrine had advantages and disadvantages, so did Royal Navy carrier doctrine, and a lot of the time, as with a lot of conflict, it just comes down to, are you able to leverage your strengths against the enemy, or does your enemy manage to sneak in during the moments when you're vulnerable? And that quite often can decide a battle as much, if not more so, than general tactic, strategy, etc., etc. BFW asks, what are some of the things you wish video games represented about naval warfare in terms of game mechanics in the steam and steel era up until the end of the period the channel covers? I mean, it depends on the video game, to be honest, because most of the elements that I'd want to see in a naval warfare video game are present, but they're not necessarily present in every single video game, or they're not present in they're not present all at once in one video game. So, for example, Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts has features like localized flooding, localized fires affecting specific systems. the fact that you might take on a list and this might affect your combat performance, both in terms of what guns you could bring to bear and its effect on your speed and that kind of stuff. So that kind of granular damage model, that I really like. But at the same time, obviously, Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts doesn't really have any capacity to handle aircraft, which is fine. I mean, aircraft can be a bit of an annoyance, but if you are building, especially some of the later period kind of World War II era stuff, what's the point of a lot of the secondary battery if you're trying to reproduce a historical vessel if there's no air threat? Whereas in something like World of Warships, you have the air threat, but you don't have the progressive flooding mechanics, etc., which is a bit odd because they were present in the beta. They took them away, I guess, to make things easier. I think my main thing is I can understand why a lot of naval warfare games tend to operate under kind of general health pool and a few specific hitbox methods, because it's easier to do and it appeals more to the general player. But sometimes it can be a little bit irritating, the fact you might have plastered a ship left, right and centre for several minutes in game, corresponding to probably a couple of hours in real life, and realistically that ship should be on fire, canted over at 20 degrees, basically unable to fight, unable to move, but because it's still got one health point and you haven't managed to specifically blow away any of its combat systems, it's still able to sail and fight and hurt you as much as it was right at the beginning of that engagement. And I don't know if this is a graphics thing, but I would say my biggest pet peeve is that the games that allow you to simulate the really, really big battles, like if you want to refight Jutland or something, tend to be relatively low graphics and or completely impenetrable even to the slightly more advanced user in terms of how to actually control them all. And the ones that are relatively easy to control and have fairly decent graphics, you can't recreate the really big battles, either because they are MMOs, which means every single ship needs to be human commanded, or they just can't, for various reasons, support the sheer number of ships on screen that they need. Eric Van Dooting asks, in the documentary of the expedition which discovered Musashi, it was noted that the team found 200 pages of original blueprints at Mitsubishi's archives in Nagasaki. Does this mean that what we now know of the Yamato class design is fairly complete and accurate despite the Japanese destruction of records at the end of World War II, or did even these blueprints omit key details? I wouldn't necessarily go that far. What they seem to have found, at least from what I can tell, is section plans for Musashi, and they seem to be relatively early section plans because there's a lot of handwritten and hand-drawn modifications, like, okay, we're changing this, we're not putting this in, change this for this other thing, or add this to this section. And I don't know, and it's not made clear, if these are the final revisions. And even if they are, they're not the final revisions, because there would have been a final draft neatly done. So at what stage during the design process were these things made? As I say, they're obviously not the last ones, so they could reflect the majority of changes, which would give us a relatively decent idea of the internals of a Yamato-class battleship, particularly the Musashi, whose plans they are. Or they could be, well, here's our first approved design, now here's a bunch of changes, and then after that they may have gone and said, okay, well, we're going to produce a revised drawing based on all of these changes, and there may have then been further changes. And we know that there were further changes because, of course, the Yamatos had various refits during their careers where things were found to work or not work on shakedown crews and in active service, which things were then replaced. The obvious one being obviously the two wing-mounted 6.6-inch being replaced by a huge nest of anti-aircraft guns, and so on and so forth. So whilst it gives us a snapshot of some stage during the final design process of Musashi, and it does vastly expand our knowledge of the interior layout or potential interior layout of that ship, I wouldn't say that we have a fairly complete and accurate idea of exactly what was going on inside the Yamatos when they were built or when they were in service, especially with the various changes that were made for them. And of course, it's not an absolutely complete set of blueprints either, because as I said, it's sections, there's other elements of the blueprints which aren't there. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, about 4 minutes into Drydock episode 228 part 1, there's a picture of what appears to be a seaman looking through some binoculars, except there are several things attached to his binoculars, or there's some kind of targeting scope. Could you please explain what he's doing and what the attachments are for? Well, this chap is the air defense officer. So this is, obviously, this set of binoculars is helping him check out incoming aircraft. So it's a fairly basic mount. There's much more complicated binocular mounts with a lot more features that can be found on things like the high angle control stations and so forth. But what this is allowing him to do is observe aircraft, and those that sort of bar stuck out in front of him will have a number of features. So it will include filters, which will mean that he won't blind himself by accident looking too close to the sun, especially on a glary day. But it will also have some basic attachments that will allow him to determine things like relative bearing, course and speed of the aircraft. Because obviously if you're just looking at an aircraft in binoculars, through binoculars, and it's just, well, it's an aircraft in the sky that's doing a thing, that may not necessarily give you any real idea of what it's doing and what directions it's going in, how fast is it advancing, and so on and so forth. Whereas with a bit of filter, so that you can actually see without blinding yourself, and a few basic indicators, you'll be able to say, okay, look, there's an enemy aircraft out there, and it's heading, 45 degrees out of from vertical towards us, speed approximately 200 knots, something like that. So the main advantage of this is that it's relatively quick to move around and search the skies, whereas the bigger, more complicated ones are perhaps less suited for this role. But then he's got the speaker tubes there, so he can tell everyone what he's seeing. If the gods wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh look, Mead asks, on coal-fueled warships, how dangerous was it to be a stoker, and what dangers did they face? Day to day, it wasn't too dangerous, but there were some rather significant dangers that you could face. For one thing, even though you were below the waterline and therefore safe from your ship being battered to pieces up in its upper works, you were also very, very deep in the ship, which meant if the ship took significant damage and started to sink, or underwater damage and you got flooding, well, you were in a prime position to be on the receiving end of that, which was not good. You could, of course, also be subject to steam leaks, which are extremely bad for your health. And when it comes specifically to coal, obviously there could be issues with prolonged exposure to coal dust. If the ship is under forced draft or any kind of higher pressure boiler environment, and somebody opens the wrong doors, then you could end up with the boiler blowing back flames straight at you. There's the perennial hazards of lots and lots of very fast, very hard labour in high heat environments, so heat stroke, exhaustion, muscle strains. If you are sent into one of the bunkers to shovel coal, there's a potential of accidentally unleashing a miniature coal avalanche, which might bury you and or break things. Plus, you've got slips, trips and falls from a relatively damp environment, burns if you touch the wrong part of a boiler, and you're also working in relatively damp conditions, so that can have effects on your lungs as well. So lots of incidental workplace dangers that can build up fairly quickly. Someone might clear at you with a shovel as well, which isn't particularly pleasant, whether that's deliberate or by accident. But if you were a stoker, there wasn't a particularly high risk of you randomly being horribly killed on any given day, but things could catch up with you, especially steam leaks and steam explosions. Those are really bad. But it's probably safer than some occupations on the ship, like anything that has to do with regularly climbing high places whilst the ship's in motion. Synchro Score asks, I remember reading a quote in which a Royal Navy officer said that his captain was On the goofing platform, is this some kind of euphemism or an actual part of the ship's structure, and where did the name come from? Unlike, I believe, over the pond, where goofing has a specific connotation to goofing off, i.e. being lazy and trying to avoid work, goofing in the Royal Navy, although there's a suggestion that you may not necessarily be, fully focused on your actual duties, it refers specifically to looking around and having a good view. So a goofing platform, a goofing deck, or a goofing spot, variously in different Royal Navy recollections, will be a place that has a really good view of something. And then people might want to go there and rest and have a look around. So it has... people talk about it as, there's the goofing platform or the goofing deck, because that's where people tend to assemble to look at something. And that might be in peacetime. They might be, we're going to look at the fancy cruise ship that's coming past. In wartime, you might very well put air search individuals up there to have a look around because it's got a good view to look for aircraft. There's an account of a bombing raid going on in World War II when the Royal Navy's under attack, and the person who's recounting it mentions that him and a bunch of his shipmates are goofing at the bomber, i.e. they're not really doing their duty so much, they're just staring in fascination at this Junkers 88, which is in the process of dropping a bomb on them all until the bomb explodes, and then they're kind of shaken out of their reverie. So, yeah, that's basically the origin, and a ship might have multiple goofing platforms or whatever, because you might have different areas with different really nice views of different things. Jeffrey Conley asks, if you were to put Nelson and HMS Victory up against one of the French Océan-class first rates under the command of Villeneuve, who do you think has a better chance to win a 1v1? Quite easily Nelson and Victory. The thing is, it's one of these classic examples of how paper stats don't necessarily stack up in the real world, because on paper, Océan has substantially more firepower, not just that she has more guns, but as we've discussed in the video on the Océan class, the French heavy guns, the 36 French pound guns, 36 livres, are significantly heavier shot than the 32 pounders on Victory. So, but, and this is a rather large but, Victory is a much better sailor than an Océan class. The Oceans aren't bad, but Victory is a superlative sailor. She's noted to have had similar sailing qualities to a 2-decker third rate, as opposed to a 3-decker first rate, which were usually a little bit slower and a little bit clumsier. And then you combine that with Nelson and an experienced British crew who will have a somewhat higher rate of fire and a better idea of how to handle their ship, which, as I said, already has a manoeuvrability advantage, versus your typical Napoleonic Wars-era French crew who are not as experienced in handling their ship, not as experienced in fighting their ship. And whilst if you had equal crews in a straight-up broadside match, an Océan class should win, what's much more likely to happen if you've got Napoleonic-era crews and Nelson versus Villeneuve is that Nelson will take Victory and pretty much do what he did to Bucentaur. He'll manoeuvre his way around the stern, deliver a massive raking broadside, and cripple the Océan class, or nearly cripple her, in a single broadside, at which point he now has a significant advantage in potentially coming around the other side and continuing his fire, potentially pulling away and doubling back and delivering another broadside to a raking broadside. And the thing is, you only need to get one decent raking broadside in with a ship with the firepower of either an Océan or Victory, and that will significantly degrade the other ship's fighting power. And given that, as we discussed, Océan will be at a disadvantage in manoeuvrability and ship handling anyway, at that point it's almost over as long as Victory doesn't do something immensely stupid. Corvus asks, during World War II, what was changed to determine the depth at which a depth charge detonated? As a small boy, I vaguely remember my father saying something about a salt wafer, but it would seem water temperature would make time vary. I do remember reading in The Enemy Below a sailor's hand being maimed as he was making an adjustment with a tool, and a whole rack shifted when a depth charge was dropped. I don't know about a wafer, but various dissolvable means were used to control time detonations on a number of explosives that the Navy used in World War II, so maybe it was talking about that. but in terms of depth charges, almost all of them used a hydrostatic pistol, which a version of is shown on screen at the moment. And essentially the way a hydrostatic pistol works, as the name suggests, it works like a pistol. So as pressure pushes in, the first thing this does is prime the pistol, because there's a little bit of tetral explosive which will be the start of the detonation chain. And as water pressure increases, it will first push in the piston to a degree that the everything is now in contact with the tetral explosive, so an impact will now detonate it. And then you can see there's springs, and as more and more pressure is exerted, that will force the springs down, which will, in very crude terms, force the equivalent of the hammer or slide back. And then, depending on what dial setting you've set it to, will determine, depending on the model of hydrostatic pistol, either how much force it needs to travel a specific distance before springing back, hitting the tetral explosive and detonating and then setting off the charge, or it can also, again, depending on the model, control how the distance of how far back that needs to go. And obviously that further back it needs to go, the more force needs to be exerted. Either way, it's to do with regulating exactly how much force needs to be exerted by the sea, i.e. in the form of pressure, before the pistol element has slid back enough to be released to then strike, to then set off the rest of the detonator, which will set off the depth charge. Colonel Overkill asks, the fact that a turret detonation is a detrimental event for the ship involved is well understood, but have there been any cases where a turret has detonated and suddenly identified as a rocket, thus exiting the ship without killing the ship as a whole? If not, would it theoretically be possible to occur, or would it be a guaranteed spontaneous vessel disassembly in all cases? There have been cases where parts of turrets have gone flying off into the sky and thus vented up an explosion which otherwise may have threatened to destroy the ship. Lion at Jutland, for example, and there's some fairly famous photos of her missing pretty much the entirety of the forward roof plate because that got blown off when there was an explosion in the turret. And in part, the fact the explosion then obviously vented out of that massive great hole played a role in why Lion was still around at the end of the battle. However, in terms of entire turrets going up into the sky, guns and all, that has been witnessed. For example, the destruction of most of the Zara class at the Battle of Cape Matapan at night. Multiple witnesses saw at least one Italian 8-inch turret go pinwheeling through the sky. The problem, however, is that most turrets have clips to hold them in. So when a ship rolls over, if its turrets fall out, that means it's either one of a small minority of ships that don't have turret clips, or the rolling over and the weight and the violence, etc., is enough to break them. So what that means that if you have an explosion that's building up inside the turret, possibly inside the barbette, but is basically venting in such a way as to try and lift the turret off, the explosion has to build up enough power, and bearing in mind it will also have minor vent points through little hatches and sighting areas and the area around the gun itself. So there'll be small vent points there, but it's got to build up enough pressure to lift the entire turret, which, depending on the type of ship, could be several hundred tons and could be several thousand tons of steel. So that's a fair bit of force you've got to build up. Plus, on top of that, if you're one of the more common ships with turret clips, you've also got to build up additional force that is sufficient to break those turret clips, or break the hull around, or the bit of the turret that's around them, which is going to be substantially more because, of course, those clips are supposed to hold in that weight against, the ship lurching around, bouncing around, being hit by explosions, hitting high waves, and so on and so forth. So that's a huge amount of pressure you have to build up. And the turret is obviously usually made of armor steel, so it's not going to break very easily, Lion aside, which means that the explosion is very rapidly going to look for paths of least resistance. And at that stage, one of the paths of lesser resistance to an area of lower pressure is going back down the shell hoists and the charge hoists down into the magazines, because they may be flash tight, but the amount of pressure that's needed to blow through some flash doors on a shell hoist system is significantly less than the pressure that's needed to break turret clips and or smash off significant portions of the turret itself in most circumstances. So if you have an explosion that is powerful enough developing either in the handling room, the barbette itself, or in the turret to send that turret pinwheeling end over end, it's almost certain to also be powerful enough that it's going to get down into the magazines and set the magazines off first, which may indeed actually provide the power that's needed to chuck the turret end over end in the first place, which is then, bad news for your ship. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, how did ship types get their names, i.e. corvettes, frigates, battleships, destroyers, schooners, brigs, etc., and what were the first and last ships to really be classified as such? Well, for the second part, unfortunately, things tend to phase in and out and are very difficult to trace for certain. So, corvettes were there for a while, then weren't there, then they've came back, then they went away again, and now they're back again. So there isn't a last vessel classified as a corvette, because there are still corvettes these days. Same thing with frigates. It came, it went, it came back again. So, and then a lot of these titles go way, 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 way back. So we can maybe point to, well, this is the first use of this term that we can see, but that's almost certainly not the first time it was actually used to describe a ship. So unfortunately, that element of the question I don't think is very easy to answer at all, except for maybe the obvious with battleships. But in terms of where the names come from, battleship is a shortening of a term. So you would previously have ships of the line, which, the ship of the line evolved from another completely separate set of ship terms, but you have the ship of the line, the classic age of sail unit, and then in the 19th century, people go from calling them ships of the line to line of battle ships, which then gets abbreviated two ways. Some people abbreviate away the last section, and you get liners, so you genuinely have first-rate warships being described as liners in the mid-19th century, and some people abbreviate it the other way, so line of battle ship, with battle and ship being two separate words. They get rid of line of, and you get battleship, which then gets put together as battleship, which tends to be the one that actually sticks around. Frigates have a very interesting and oft debated origin, but it seems potentially to have come from a Western Mediterranean area and term. Most people advance the idea of the term fregata, meaning essentially fast. Now, whether that's Spanish, French, Italian, loaned off of the Ottomans or whatever, there's a lot of argument about it. But basically, the term shows up in the Italian city-states as fregata, or close to, which, as I said, people at that point have basically taken to mean a fast sailing ship, as opposed to what at the time is a great ship, which would later become a ship of the line. And from there, it evolves to mean a single-decked rated warship, i.e. what we would call a fifth or a sixth rate, and occasionally fourth rates. Destroyer is an abbreviation or a shortening of torpedo boat destroyer. So people invented torpedo boats. Name's fairly self-explanatory, small boat, or technically ship in some cases, that carries torpedoes to attack other ships. And then somebody went, okay, well, we don't like this, so we shall build a slightly larger vessel which carries guns, small quick-firing guns designed to destroy these small, fast vessels, and we shall call it the torpedo boat destroyer. And then someone said, well, while you're out there being small and fast and shooting up the enemy torpedo boats, why don't we have some torpedoes on those ships as well, so that once they've destroyed the enemy torpedo boats, they can go in and torpedo the enemy. And they're like, this seems like a good idea. And so the torpedo boat destroyer became the destroyer, which also then took over the role of both the previous ships. Corvette is another one that people argue about a lot, but the most likely origin for me is et is a diminutive, and Corf or Corver, depending on if you think it's originating from France or from the Netherlands, seems to indicate some kind of fast vessel. Corver, I think that's how it's pronounced, or Corver in Dutch, is pursuing ship, chasing ship, and with et combined, and this is obviously being a French term now, it designates a small, fast pursuit ship. The French use it to denote a small frigate in the 15th century. So it's a small warship that is smaller than a frigate, but still used to chase things down. Brig originally seems to be a derivative of brigandine, i.e. aggressive fighting, piratical. It has those kind of connotations, probably from the fact that two-masted vessels were quite often seen in the Mediterranean. Two-masted small vessels were often seen in the Mediterranean as piratical vessels and raiding vessels and general-purpose small warships. And fighty ship with two masts and a specific kind of rig eventually becomes brig. Schooner seems to be debated, but possibly has a reference to a slang word for skipping across the water, skipping stones across the water, and a schooner is a very fast vessel that seems to skip across the water, so maybe there's that. This is the thing, a lot of the older definitions, the exact origins are very much still under discussion. Of course, when you get things like sloops and brigs later on, their specific kind of rigging gets codified, and then after that, brigs and sloops are defined as much by their rigs as by their purpose, but that's a later development compared to their original origins. The Wind Thief asks, in the age of sail, how are iron cannons kept from rusting whilst at sea? Well, obviously you would keep them inboard as much as possible. You only run them out for practice or for battle. But an iron gun would need very frequent cleaning, sometimes as often as daily, to make sure that it didn't rust. Now, there are period accounts where people tried various interesting tricks to try and slow down or prevent rusting, whether that involved applying oils or waxes. At one point, leaves from certain trees found in the tropics were tried, essentially in modern parlance to try and give some kind of sealant or coating to the guns to stop them rusting out. Of course, you'd have a tompion or tampion in the barrel to stop water getting down there, or you'd clean it out after firing practice, and you'd use something like leather or wood to stop up the firing hole, stop water or moisture getting in there as well. There's even one reference which I recall from a while ago where at least one gun crew decided to try and work out how to blue their gun, although I'm not necessarily sure if it worked or not. The one thing they wouldn't do is paint them. You see a lot of black painted guns these days, and that's fair enough because these days they're museum pieces, so painting them black retains approximately their colour whilst stopping them from rusting, and means they don't need daily attention. However, if you painted a cannon and then you had to fire it dozens of times during a battle, you'd end up with burning paint fumes in the ship, which, if you've got 100 plus guns and they're all cooking off burning paint, that is not a good thing. So paint, although it pops up occasionally in some very, very occasional records in navies that have had far too long a peace, that's not really a common anti-rust method. It's mostly just keeping an eye on it and making sure it's cleaned as often as needed, and occasionally trying something experimental to see if you can prevent the onset of rust, because that makes your job a lot easier, because if you don't have to clean it every day, good for you. Then we were asked, what did the typical sailor's meal look like in British, US, German, Italian, Japanese and Soviet vessels during World War II, both U-boat and surface combat vessels? Unfortunately, that's not a question you're ever going to get answered in a dry dock in full. In fact, I don't even necessarily think that you would be able to answer that question in full in a single Wednesday video, because by World War II, there is a huge variety of food, and its availability varies not only by navy, but also by ship type, by location, and by time period during the war. But in broad strokes, the submarine service, whether that be British, Italian, American, or German, etc., generally had this weird dichotomy of the navies usually tried to supply them with better, higher quality foods as part of essentially the hazard pay of being submarine crews, but equally those would eventually run out, and then you'd have to resort to whatever was the most compact and most economical way of storing food in a submarine, which doesn't have a lot of room. So whilst those up on the larger ships on the surface would perennially complain about things like powdered milk, powdered eggs, powdered potato, dehydrated potato, slightly different to powdered, and so on and so forth, once you ran out of your premium quality fresh stuff on a sub, you were basically down to dehydrated, powdered, or canned everything. There's not a lot of space on a U-boat to have a particularly extensive galley for apart from anything else. Obviously, tinned food could include things like soup, which could be pretty nice, but you just had to hope they had a soup that you liked. Up on ships, it's not quite as bad as the Age of Sail, but you could stock a ship with a lot of very fresh produce when you were leaving a port, but then you'd eventually run out of that, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks in, depending on what exactly you'd gotten in what quantities. The refrigeration aboard a ship would obviously allow you to extend the shelf life of some of those foods, but some foods just don't refrigerate well at all. Then you'd be down to your refrigerated goods, which, as I say, that can last a fair while. So you might have absolutely fresh meat, let's say for the first few days while you're out at sea, and then you might be down to deep frozen meat, which, from what I'm told, is not necessarily quite as good as something that's never been frozen, and obviously is going to be just more generic and bulk stuff. And then you're also going to be subjected to your dried foods, lentils, rice, and then into your dehydrated and powdered foods as well, bulking things up. A lot of people not particularly keen on some of those as far as the accounts go. But because you have a lot more storage space and you have chilled areas and bigger galleys, you can do things on surface ships, especially the big ones, that you can't necessarily do on really small vessels like Corvettes or on subs. Things like baking fresh bread. As long as you have flour and the other ingredients, a limited amount of fresh bread can be produced each day on something like a battleship, a cruiser, or a carrier. Then you've also got the variations between the nations. So the Japanese obviously are going to be issuing people with a lot of rice, whereas potatoes and bread are going to be much more common on British and American ships. And yes, of course, pasta will be common on Italian ships. Sauerkraut will show up on German ships, etc., etc., etc. It's national flavors, national preferences in their cuisine. Ideally, captains would try and keep the meals varied, so there might be a set weekly menu, but that menu would rotate through each day. And so there would usually be a significant variety, but then of course you have to take into account that, for example, as the war presses on Japan, they have not just shortages of varieties of food, but just flat out shortages of food. So you might not get a lot and it might be very samey all the time, whereas an American ship is likely to be considerably better supplied than average. We just talked about ice cream earlier this week at the time of release. And then you've also got to account for your distance from not just port in terms of fresh versus preserved, but also your distance from home. Because if you are, let's say, on convoy runs and you have just left the USA, you'll probably be stocked up with a lot of pretty nice food. Whereas if you are on, week 15 of your deployment off of the Japanese coast, and the last time you saw US soil was when your ship left Pearl Harbor 8 months ago, the chances are you've just been grabbing whatever resupply foods have been available either from at-sea transfers or maybe, if you're lucky, from Ulithi, which means your menu choices have probably become significantly more reduced, hence why Coca-Cola barges and ice cream barges and so forth were so prevalent at Ulithi to keep the morale up of people who'd probably just been eating spam and powdered eggs for days on end. So with all that variety, I could do, a whole series spread out over the course of a number of years on what various navies in the World War II ate. I mean, using either the US Navy cookbook or various menus posted up on British museum ships like Cavalier and Belfast, there's probably at least 2 or 3 videos for each of those navies going into just what a typical sailor would be served in a typical week. And then you'd have to go and look for at least a video on what would be eaten on a British submarine and then another on an American submarine, and so on and so on and so forth. So yeah, unfortunately, you're not going to get a full answer, just a typical overview answer. And who knows, maybe next year there's an opportunity for a series of food-based videos. We'll have to see how this ice cream one does. Aboreg asks, a while back I was doing research on the USS Harder and ran into an interesting discrepancy in that the captain claimed that he sank 2 destroyers on the night of June 9th, 1944, when post-war analysis showed that Japan only lost the Tanakaze that night. However, I also found amongst other records of that day, Tanakaze had sortied with its sister ship Isokaze, the Yugamo-class destroyer Hayashimo, and the Shimakaze to react to submarine sightings in the area that Harder was operating in. Harder's after-action report claimed that 2 destroyers were closing in on it when it fired a 4-fish down-the-throat shot, and visually confirmed 2 hits on the lead destroyer, which presumably was Tanakaze, and 1 hit on the rear destroyer, which has never been officially identified. Harder then dived for about 10 minutes, then came back up and found no contacts even with a radar sweep. It is of my belief that the rear destroyer suffered negligible damage from the torpedo, then motored away so fast that it actually got out of Harder's radar range before it came to the surface. And doing some quick math, I believe that of the 3 other ships sent out with Tanakaze, only Shimakaze could conceivably have pulled off such a stunt. Do you agree with this assessment? I mean, it is a possibility. The one thing you've got to bear in mind is that although all 4 ships would have sortied to investigate submarine sightings, it doesn't necessarily mean they're all close together. I mean, there's 4 ships, but from the sounds of it, Harder reports 2. And I found, obviously the prematurely detonating torpedo wouldn't cause any damage, and the other 3 ships all seem to have been in action very soon after these events, so clearly none of them took any particular damage. But I did find this on the tabular record of movement for Isokaze. So at 2200, Tanakaze and Isokaze are sweeping together. The night is dark and quiet. Before that, the record says at 1000, this is from Isokaze's tabular record of movement, departed with Tanakaze in response to reports of enemy submarine activity and the sinking of Hayanami on the 7th of June. Destroyers Shimakaze and Hayashimo joined up at times outside the lagoon. Most of these returned to Tawi Tawi Lagoon at dusk, but Tanakaze and Isokaze were to remain at sea for the evening. Then at 2200, Tanakaze and Isokaze are sweeping together. The night is dark and quiet. And at 2225, Tanakaze is shaken with explosions that sank her immediately just outside Tawi Tawi Atoll. No submarine or aircraft had been detected. Since the cause was unknown, Isokaze refrained from dropping depth charges, which would only endanger the survivors, but departed the scene at once. And this is in brackets. Tanakaze had in fact been torpedoed by USS Harder SS-257. So on that basis, at least if the tabular record of movement is accurate, it would seem that at the time of the torpedoing, Shimakaze and Hayashimo have actually gone back to harbour. And so what Harder is seen is Tanakaze and Isokaze. He scored 2 hits on Tanakaze and then had probably a prematurely detonating torpedo that was somewhat near Isokaze, which has just gone, yeah, maybe not, and skedaddled out of there. But if all 3 had been operating together, then Shimakaze probably would have been the only one that would be fast enough to pull out of the area quickly enough if it was any combination of the 4 ships. But of course, Isokaze is already moving and that doesn't need to accelerate to top speed. That's probably enough to get out of Harder's radar range. Or it could just be that Harder wasn't looking in the direction that Isokaze went. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, did the Dutch ships that survived the end of ABDA command have any meaningful involvement in the remainder of the war? Well, to be fair, there weren't that many Dutch ships that survived the end of ABDA command, But of those that did, major surface units, yeah, sadly not a huge number, but the Tromp, as seen here, did pretty good service for the next few years as a convoy escort, mostly in the Indian Ocean and the Southern Pacific. And then once the war against the Japanese started to surge back into Japanese-held territory in a big way, Tromp then joined the British Pacific Fleet as part of the offensive action. So she saw out the entire war doing something or other that was relatively useful for the war effort. We've spoken before about the Flores-class gunboats. They just decided to motor along, killing everything that they could get their hands on in terms of shore bombardment duties. And some of the Dutch submarines actually survived the end of ABDA command as well. Dutch submarines did tend to have a rather spectacularly short lifespan in the early start of the Pacific campaign, but the ones that survived did tend to hang around for quite a while thereafter. They were all generally fairly effective, but the survivors, usually if you survived that first few months of World War II and you were a Dutch submarine, you tended to survive the rest of it, and they would continue in, obviously, submarine patrols going after Japanese targets to relatively decent effect, especially in the latter part of 42 and early 43, when they were probably the only submarines in any significant numbers present in the Pacific with reliably working torpedoes. Little Dweller asks, during World War II, how much was the UK able to make use of the English Channel for civilian traffic? Were unescorted ships able to make the transit, or did the Royal Navy run convoys through? Chancing the Channel for the bulk of this time period was a good way to find yourself on the wrong end of the Luftwaffe, or if you're at night, the occasional E-boat. So yeah, unescorted ships, not really gonna go through. However, the Royal Navy did run convoys through pretty consistently, so if you're interested in which ones, you can look up convoy codes CE and CW, Channel East and Channel West, rather originally, and those convoys began pretty much at the start of the war, and the last of them ran in 1944. Essentially, the British were running convoys through the Channel pretty much up until the advance forward of the Allied armies displaced the Germans from being able to easily hit the Channel with aircraft, and at that point also obviously the Germans had more pressing concerns on their mind, like massive British, Canadian and American formations closing in on them. So yeah, not necessarily entirely uninterrupted, but relatively continuous series of convoys between 1939 and 1944. And in 1940-41, they definitely suffered quite heavily from the air attack, as you can see here. An opening part of the Battle of Britain was a prolonged operation by the Luftwaffe against various convoys. Fred the Red asks, how did clothing work on Royal Navy Age of Sail ships? Did the average sailor have any real change of clothes? And how, if at all, were clothes washed? I assume water was far too precious to be used for such a thing. As with many things in the Age of Sail, it could depend quite a lot on the captain's predilection. You know, if the captain really wanted you to be clean, then you'd be washing your clothes a lot more often. If you really didn't care, you might rarely do so. Sailors would have at least a couple of changes of clothes, apart from anything damage and so forth was an issue, and sailors would have sea chests or sea bags where they could store alternate changes of clothes, because, well, apart from anything, at the very minimum, you need something to wear or not wear, as the case may be, in very hot environments, and something to keep you a bit warmer in really cold environments. And if you're really lucky, you might even have something that will help you keep a little bit drier when it gets really, really wet, but wouldn't hold out too much hope on that last one in your typical Age of Sail vessel. Exactly how many changes of clothes you'd have would depend on how much storage space you had, whether or not you thought it was worth it, and if you had any decent amount of money. So, you know, if you'd had recently got a bunch of prize money, you might furnish yourself with a nice, decent set of clothes, which you'd probably keep for special occasions and going on shore leave if you wanted to impress people, and keep maybe a spare change of clothes for work at sea, and then your regular sea service clothes, which you just let wear out or patch up as the case may be. Whereas if you're a bit down on your luck, you might only have the one change of clothes. Now, typical washing would be done by salt water. You just bring salt water up over the side in buckets or by a pump, and then everybody tries to get their clothes as clean as possible on your designated washing days. And yes, if there were women aboard, they would usually get lumped with doing the washing, for a price, of course. However, as those of you who've served at sea or been near the sea will know, washing things with salt water doesn't really work. Stuff never really quite gets dry, and it's much better to wash clothes in fresh water. But you're not going to let people use fresh water, your precious freshwater supplies, on just basic washing. Occasionally appeals would be made if the environment really called for it. But if it rained, then that was a very good opportunity to either start washing your clothes in the fresh rainwater or to gather the rainwater in order for subsequent washing. And that's noted on several occasions. When it rains, either everyone being told, right, okay, time to start scrubbing your clothes, or time to set barrels and funnels and channels up so that you could wash later on. Robert Knapp asks, in your opinion, do you think the post-war modernisation of HMS Victorious was worth the immense cost and time? And also, how would you have gone about modernising the surviving illustrious class and their successor classes? No, the modernisation of Victorious, despite the installation of the glorious dustbin of doom on its bridge, as you can see here, is never, ever going to be worth it. The illustrious class, they have their place in World War II, but they have limitations when it comes to the 50s, the hangar height being one of them. I mean, okay, fair enough, the update to Illustrious did also raise the hangar height, but ultimately, you've got Victorious, you've got the Centaurs. The Centaurs are about the same size as in Illustrious, but their hangar is 2 foot higher, or 1.5 to 2 foot higher. And then you've got the Audaciouses, which are bigger and also have an even taller hangar still. So if you're planning to modernise and refit a carrier to last a long time, you've also the Centaurs and the Audacious have a lot less mileage on them. Just spend the time and money modernising one of those. It's going to be so much easier. And if you're going to go through the ridiculous expense that they went through with Victorious of basically ripping up the flight deck and the hangar and rebuilding it virtually twice, then you might as well use one of the Implacables. They're bigger, they're more capable. Yes, the Implacables have 2 very short hangars, one on top of the other, but if you're worried about all the top weight of new systems and so forth, you could exchange 2 short hangars for 1 very tall hangar and still bring the overall height and therefore effects on stability down somewhat. If you're absolutely going to box someone in a corner and say, okay, the Illustrious class and the Implacables have to be kept around, then what I personally do, well, as I say, for the Implacables, would be to combine the 2 hangars into a taller hangar and drop the whole thing down slightly, the flight deck. And for the Illustrious class, well, with their existing hangar height, it's just about tall enough to fit a Westland Whirlwind, and I don't mean the twin-engine fighter of early World War II. I mean the Westland Whirlwind, the helicopter, which is just coming into service around the time they're thinking of modernising Victorious. So what I would personally do is spend the money updating the Centaurs and, well, Ark Royal and Eagle are barely even finished at this point, but spend the money modernising the ships that already have hangars tall enough to accommodate a decent height aircraft of the 1950s and convert the Illustriouses into helicopter carriers, because they can just about fit the helicopters that are in use at the time, and being the smaller vessels, that's probably the best use you can get out of them anyway. Primark 359 asks, how tolerated was the use of opium by Royal Navy sailors before, during and after the Opium Wars? Am I correct in the assumption that the carriage of large cargoes of opium was done by East Indiamen and not Royal Navy vessels? But would Royal Navy vessels perhaps carry small cargoes of opium to sell to buy fresh supplies from Asian ports? It's a bit of a weird one, because generally speaking, there weren't particular restrictions on the use of opium per se in British society in most of the 19th century, much the same as there weren't regulations on its use in China until the Chinese realized that the effects of having a nation full of opium addicts and tried to ban it, hence starting a chain of events that would lead to the Opium Wars. But when it comes to the Navy itself, although you obviously had the rum ration and various other things, various other forms of alcohol, the use of opium, widespread use of opium by the crew, was not usually tolerated by most captains, simply because of the effect it had on people. The Royal Navy, at least in the 19th century, to a certain extent, couldn't care less what exactly you got up to with your spare time and with your spare money, as long as it didn't affect your ability to perform your duties. So, anything that involves smoking something involves the use of fire, which is dangerous on ships, so there's that element as well. But pipes and cigarettes, to a certain degree, again, depending on the captain, could be tolerated, because, at least in the immediate term, smoking tobacco didn't really affect your ability to conduct your duty. If you were drunk, even though the Royal Navy obviously issued you alcohol, but if you got drunk, then you'd get in trouble, because the Royal Navy didn't want you drunk, because that affects your ability to carry out your duty. And if you're off your face on opium, then you can't carry out your duty, so you're not going to be allowed to do that either. And that's pretty much the same before, during, and after the Opium Wars. If it affects your ability to fight the ship, to sail the ship, and to respond to orders, you're not going to be allowed it on a Royal Navy vessel. And yes, the Royal Navy is not a cargo service, so the various East Indiamen and other British merchants that are trying to move opium into and out of China, that is a civilian concern. The Royal Navy is not involved in that. The Royal Navy is involved in shooting at Chinese war junks and so forth, but that's more to do with the general principles of trade that the British reckoned they were fighting for in the Opium Wars, not because Royal Navy ship of the line had several hundred tons of opium sitting in the hold waiting to be delivered. As far as Royal Navy ships trading themselves for supplies and so forth, no. Again, most of the time supplies would be issued by the Navy and prearranged by the Navy. This was long past the age of the ships themselves having to rock up to ports and negotiate independently for supplies. They could do that if they wanted, if there's some discretionary funds and so forth. But again, though, the Royal Navy is not supposed to be a cargo carrying service or a profit making service. So if any Royal Navy ship was carrying a small amount of opium and then used it in trade, it would have been the personal property of a ship's officer or some of the crew, assuming that the captain of the ship knew about and permitted that to occur, but it wouldn't be an official Royal Navy conducting trade issue. Paul from Chicago asks, what is the tidal change in the Suez Canal, and is this how the larger British cruisers and King George V class battleships were able to traverse the canal, despite it supposedly only having a 15-foot draft? Are there pools along the canal with deeper drafts for larger ships to stay afloat during the changing of the tides? Well, the simple answer is that the Suez Canal has never been only 15 foot deep. The Suez Canal started in the middle of the 1800s at 26 foot and a bit depth in the deepest part, which, okay, that's still not quite enough for a County or a King George V class to pass on a good day. But the Suez Canal subsequently underwent several dredging and widening efforts, such that, as you can see here with HMS Howe, by the time of the Second World War, there's not really a problem with something the size of King George V motoring on through. Although, as you can see from where the waterline is, she is riding a little light as she journeys through. And, some ships would disembark stores and other non-essentials to assist with passing through the canal, because obviously the less they draw in terms of draft, the less chance there is of just about going aground. There's less chance of, there's more canal to use, because obviously the canal starts to slope up on either side, and it's just generally good practice. But there's not really a problem for most warships in World War I or World War II to use the canal, because it's a much larger entity than it was when it opened, and it's a much larger entity now than it was in World War II. As far as tidal differences, according to the Suez Canal Authority, the tidal changes are different depending on which part of the canal you're at. The Suez Canal Authority says that the extreme tidal range is about 2 foot at the north end of the canal, and possibly up to 6 foot in the south. So if you're talking about the original flavour, 26 foot and change Suez Canal, and you're in the southern part of it, then maybe, well, at that point, a county class or King George V would have issues getting through the southern end. But by World War II, that wasn't the case. Around the turn of the century, the canal was deepened to 30 feet, and then in 1920 it was deepened again to 40 feet, which meant, about 40 foot depth, and with the deep channel running about 100 foot across, it was just about possible to slot any reasonable sized ship down there. John Plate asks, I was reading on the comments from your video about the Alaskas, and somebody just suggested an escort battleship. How do you make an escort battleship? Well, I generally have no idea what an escort battleship would actually look like. A battleship purpose-built civilian aircraft carrier escort above and beyond everything else, but I thought I'd give it a shot anyway, and so I came up with this monstrosity. 33 knots, same speed as an Iowa. And essentially, what I've done, at least here, is I've taken the general layout of an Iowa forward with triple 16-inch 50s and just not installed the aft turret. And that means, as you can see, I've covered it in 40mm Bofors. We've got the standard twin 5-inch 38s down each side. But then you've got this wonderfully absurd stepped tiering of 5-inch 38 twin mounts in place of the aft turret. There's 3 there. I was going to put a 4th and maybe even a 5th or running down to the stern, but Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts wouldn't let me put any further back than that. Also, to be honest, if you're doing an escort battleship, you'd probably have a superfiring 5-inch twin in front of the bridge, superfiring over the forward turret, because essentially what this is giving you is 6 guns, so essentially battle cruiser type firepower, but 6 guns of 16-inch 50, that's more than enough to see off almost anything, and it's giving you an extra broadside, especially if you have the extra couple of 5-inch 38 mounts I'd want to put in, 1 fore, 1 aft. That's now giving you a total potential broadside of your original 10 guns plus another 10 guns. So you've got a total broadside of 20 5-inch 38s. And of course you can cluster a bunch of 40mm round the aft where you couldn't before because of the presence of the main battery. And I guess that's an escort battleship. You know, it'll see off a Congo. It'll probably even see off a Nagato. It'll see off anything that's not really a Yamato or some other oversized fast battleship. And even then, it's got a reasonable chance. And it's got absolutely insane levels of anti-aircraft firepower. So I guess that's an escort battleship? Question mark? I mean, anyone else want to come up with a different idea? Feel free. Christopher Goebel asks, I understand the tactical value of having a high top speed, but how much does speed matter at a strategic level? For example, would being able to reach a certain theatre in a given amount of time matter much to a navy? It can matter very much on 2 levels. Firstly, if you have a navy where lots of ships are quite quick, so destroyers, cruisers, carriers, let's say, can all top 30 knots. Destroyers might have some fuel issues if they're going particularly long distances, but that's what resupply at sea is for. So if most elements of your navy can exceed 30 knots, but say your battle fleet can't, whether that's 21 knots or 28 knots or something in between, then that limits how quickly your entire navy can get there. And if you need a show of strength, show the flag, reinforcements, that kind of thing, then even in isolation without escorts, obviously a capital ship of 21 or 28 knots is less capable than one of 33 knots, and the 28 knot one is more capable than the 21 knot one, and so on and so forth. And yes, being able to reach a certain theatre in a given amount of time very much does matter to navies. It may be to beat the enemy navy there. You know, possession is 9/10 of the law. If you're the one who's there first, it makes it very difficult for the other guy to dislodge you, which can prevent an entire war from happening before the first shot is fired. Or you might need to reinforce a fleet that's there already. And it also gives you the ability to be in potentially multiple places at once. So let's take extreme examples with an Iowa and a standard type. So one's capable of 21 knots, one's capable of 33 knots, and let's assume the enemy is vaguely mirror matching you. So 21 knots equates to 24 miles an hour, 33 knots equates to 38 miles an hour, and that adds up to a ship that's capable of keeping up 21 knots for a day, 24 hours, can travel 576 miles in a day, assuming it's going in a straight line and no other effects like wind and waves and currents. But a 33-knot ship can cover 912 miles, which, that suddenly becomes quite the big difference. So, to take an example, if I get using the US and Japan because the Pacific is nice and big, if you have a US fleet based at Pearl Harbor and you have a Japanese fleet based in Tokyo Harbor, it's just over 5,000 miles from Pearl Harbor to the San Bernardino Straits in the middle of the Philippines. It's only 1,850 miles direct from Tokyo to the same location. So, there's well over 3,000 mile head start for the Japanese. Now, if the Japanese fleet is capable of 21 knots, it's going to take them a bit over 3 days to get to the San Bernardino Straits. Whereas if they're capable of 33 knots, it's going to take them about 2 days. So they get there a day and a bit earlier. Conversely, for the US fleet based out of Pearl Harbor, even though the Japanese fleet only has to go about 40 to 45% the distance that they do, if they're capable of making 33 knots, they can get there in just over 5.5 days. But if they're only capable of 21 knots, they need almost 9 days to get there. So if we take the two extremes, if the Japanese fleet is capable of 33 knots and the US fleet is capable of only 21 knots, then there's going to be basically almost 7 days between the Japanese fleet showing up in the Philippines and the American fleet showing up in the Philippines, assuming that both sides are going at full speed the entire time and they're heading for the San Bernardino Strait in a straight line. So obviously exact figures will vary a bit. But a Japanese fleet that shows up at the Philippines, even though it's, which is obviously much closer to Japan, has a week to do what it wants before the Americans show up. Flip it on its head, if the Japanese fleet can only do 21 knots, but the American fleet can do 33, then all of a sudden the difference closes to about 2 days. Now, that's still an advantage to the Japanese. They have 2 days unmolested, but you can accomplish a lot less in 2 days than you can in 7. And then factor in intel and stuff. If the Japanese fleet is sitting idle and suddenly vast numbers of men start arriving, stores start to be loading, and then they have to wake up all the boilers and everything, that's going to take time. So if you've got a little bit of intelligence on the ground in Tokyo, and they're able to radio in, hey, the Japanese fleet just started loading shells and men and supplies, and it looks like the engineering crew are going aboard, so they're going to start waking the boilers. They're probably going to be sailing in a day or two. Then if the US fleet, expecting trouble, is standing ready and can sail very soon thereafter, it's possible that the US fleet might show up, if they're a 33-knot fleet, at the Philippines around about the same time the Japanese fleet does, which affords the Japanese basically no options to do anything, assuming the Japanese are the slower fleet. Whereas if you get that same warning and the situation is inverted, it still doesn't matter. The Japanese have still got the better part of a week, even if you sail immediately. And that's in a situation where the distances are very much in favour of the Japanese. If you look at a situation where the distances are a little bit more equal, then the benefit of this higher top speed on a strategic level becomes even more obvious. And even on a sort of the interface between tactical and strategic, when you look at the ranges of various aircraft, for example. So if an aircraft can strike from a land base with a heavy payload and say it can go 400 miles, and let's assume a 12-hour period of darkness in World War II, so maybe these aircraft can't operate at night. If you need to escort a carrier strike in, and let's say for sake of argument you need to get 200 miles off the coast, maybe your carrier aircraft have a shorter range, maybe they're striking targets inland, so it's not just the distance to the shore, they have to go further in as well. But let's say you need to get 200 miles offshore, so you've got a 200-mile danger space to cross. At 33 knots, that's going to take you about 5 hours. So if you've got 12 hours of darkness, that theoretically gives you, assuming you cross your danger zone at exactly sunset, which you probably don't have to do, you can probably start heading into that danger zone earlier than that, because anyone who sees you is going to have to report back and the enemy aircraft are going to have to come find you. So let's extend it by, let's say, 2 hours either side of things. So you now have 16 hours total. So if you start at your first hour, at 0 hour, and you need 5 hours to get to your 200-mile point, so you're now down to 11 hours, you now have 6 hours for your carriers to conduct their strike and recover their aircraft, and then you can leave, and come sunrise, well, come just after sunrise the next morning when the enemy aircraft can reach out to their maximum danger spots, you've just crossed over the terminator line and they can't touch you. And, you know, if you need less than 6 hours to conduct your carrier strike, then you're free and home much, much earlier. Whereas if you are in a 21-knot fleet, you need just over 8 hours to cross that same distance, which means that even with a 16-hour window, you're going to get to the point where you can launch your carrier aircraft, and then you're going to have to immediately turn around and start leaving again, because otherwise you're going to be caught by enemy shore-based aircraft the next day. So, yeah, on everything from a sort of interface of tactical and strategic all the way up to grand strategy, having a significant speed advantage over your opponent for your entire fleet or for your battleships is quite good. Connor Johnson asks, how naval does a ship have to get to be a 5-minute guide? To use an example that doesn't exactly need one due to the plethora of other videos on the topic, RMS Olympic spent most of World War I as HMT Olympic, transporting troops to support the war effort, during which time it was under control of the Admiralty. Would that be enough to warrant a 5-minute guide? My general rule of thumb is, has this ship been under the control of the Admiralty for warlike purposes, i.e. they haven't just commandeered it as a transport and said you're moving X from Y from position A to position B or something, or has this ship at the very minimum been built with potential warlike use in mind, at which point it would qualify for a 5-minute guide. I mean, I'd probably put full-on warships as a priority, but if, say, Patreon voted on it, then I'd go for it. Now, in the past, I've covered things like fleet oilers. They are commissioned parts of the Navy, and although any armament they carry is relatively minimal, they do have a direct part in supporting the fleet when it's at war. Something like the Olympic-class liners would also merit that. I mean, Britannic and Olympic both served in World War I, but also, perhaps more to the point, they, along with things like Lusitania and Mauritania, were built partially with Admiralty subsidies, with specially strengthened parts of their deck, such that in the event of war they could be taken into Admiralty service and fitted out with guns as armed merchant cruisers or auxiliary cruisers. That was part of the design, and therefore there is a naval connection. Similarly, like I've covered Great Eastern. Great Eastern was used by the Navy as a troop transport and armed with cannon at one point. So, it's just about on the edge of qualifying, but it does qualify. And then you also have things like the San Demetrio. So it's a freighter. It's never been in Admiralty service, never was, never will be, but it was involved in a naval action, albeit somewhat unwillingly, with the Admiral Scheer. So, something like San Demetrio, where it's a relatively interesting story that's been involved directly in some form of maritime conflict, would probably be the absolute lowest bar. Whereas, a ship that doesn't have any special modifications for potential Admiralty usage and has never seen action and possibly wasn't even in service when the nation in question was ever in a serious maritime conflict, that wouldn't merit being covered. TXK234 asks, how important was the Naval Defense Act of 1889 and was it successful in what the British wanted to accomplish? The Naval Defense Act of 1889 was pretty important. It's the act that established the two-power standard, i.e. the idea that Britain should have a navy that was as powerful as the next two largest navies combined, something that Britain had kind of aimed vaguely towards for most of the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars, but now it was codified into law that this had to occur. In as far as giving Britain a very large fleet, it was successful. In as far as making that fleet considerably more economical per ship, it was fairly successful, because it meant that the Royal Navy was mandated by law to have a certain number of ships, which was based on how many ships the other guys had, which meant that the era of the Royal Navy going, well, we'd like this many ships, or this kind of ships, or etc., etc. And then Parliament going, well, yeah, maybe, but also next year, no, we're going to take that money away, which led to a very stop-start nature of construction and extended construction over years that were unnecessary, and actually led to overall increased costs, because as it turns out, if you delay the construction of a ship, you don't actually end up paying less, you just end up paying slightly less per year, but you very rapidly discover that the overall cost over the extended period actually adds up to more than if you just ponied up the money up front and got it finished on time. Something that, shall we say, later governments have tended to forget, willfully or not. In any case, so the Royal Navy was getting ships at a more economical price, but it was costing more because they were having to build a lot more ships. So, you know, a little bit of swings and roundabouts there. The shipbuilding industry took a huge injection in the arm, a nice big boost, because suddenly they were being called on to build loads of cruisers and destroyers and battleships left, right and centre, and to get them out there ASAP, which was good for most people. Another benefit is because you needed to have lots of ships built all at once, it led pretty quickly to the abandonment of what was becoming, in my opinion at least, a rather dangerous practice within the Royal Navy of building a handful of ships here and there, 1s and 2s and 3s, to specifically counter a ship that a foreign navy had produced, which usually ended up being stupidly expensive and also left the Navy with a weird and wonderful collection of different ships, which tended not to be particularly interoperable with each other, because, you know, if Italy one moment is building a battleship with absolutely gargantuan guns, well, then the Royal Navy has to build a battleship with absolutely gargantuan guns, which may not be the world's fastest or most agile ship, but the next year Russia's invented an armoured cruiser, and now the Royal Navy must build some really big, really fast, really expensive cruisers. And how a really fast cruiser is supposed to operate alongside a really slow battleship, you know, and then baby France comes along with a really heavily gunned cruiser, but it's slower. So now the Royal Navy has to build an even more heavily gunned cruiser with even more armour, but it's slower than the really fast one they built to counter the Russians. So now even the two cruisers can't operate together. And then somebody else comes along with a series of compact, fast battleships that they can build on large numbers. Well, now the Royal Navy has to build compact, fast, second-class battleships, which don't really have any operational or interoperational capability with the big, slow, heavy one that they built to counter the Italians. So it was a complete mess. Whereas now you have to set it on a design and go, okay, we're building 4, 6, 8, 12 of these. So standardization, that's really actually very, very useful. The one big thing that the Naval Defense Act of 1889 desperately wanted to do, at least in the long term, was to cut Royal Navy expenditure. The idea being that if you told everyone else, well, look, by law, Britain, which at this stage is still the biggest economy in the world, if you account for the British Empire, and as a whole, and has the biggest navy in the world already, and the world's biggest shipbuilding industry, you know, Britain now, by law, will massively exceed your fleet, so you probably can just not bother trying to match us. You know, in the past, you could try and hope that political division internally would allow you to catch up. But now, by law, we have to not just be bigger than you, we have to be bigger than the guy who's next in line to you. So you're never going to get there. So calm down with all your naval shipbuilding. And then, of course, the knock-on is, if everyone else comes down with their naval shipbuilding because they know they can't beat Britain, then Britain also doesn't have to build too many ships, so overall long-term saves money. Nice in theory. It turns out that being very condescending to a bunch of other First World great powers doesn't really work very well, and they tried anyway. And now by law, Britain had to keep up with them, because remember when the 1889 Act was passed, the two largest fleets were France and Russia. By the time the standard was abandoned officially, I mean unofficially they kind of abandoned it to be 60% greater than Germany during the Anglo-German naval arms race, but officially the two-power standard wasn't abandoned until the Washington Naval Treaty, essentially, which meant that by the time you got to even the Anglo-German naval arms race, let alone any point thereafter, you are now having to, by law, build a fleet that was bigger than Germany and America's combined. That's a lot of ships. That's very expensive. So, yeah, in terms of being a cost-saving exercise, that fell completely flat on its face. And, partially as a result of that, also probably sparked a bunch of naval arms races, which caused that spiraling cost escalation. Because, as I said, telling other nations what they're to do with their navies doesn't really work unless you back it up with force of arms. And the Royal Navy wasn't, at least in the late 19th century, about to go to war with a bunch of people and steal all their ships just because they annoyed them. That was seen as early 19th century Navy behaviour. Atomic Braytonic asks, in an alternate scenario where the British end up being the ones who mainly end up fighting the Japanese, how well do you think their naval tactics and ships would hold up? Would it work well? Would it not work at all? Assuming the US is playing a minuscule role and the Royal Navy can deploy the bulk of their fleet to fight the Japanese. So I guess we're assuming no European war. A lot of it's going to depend on when this war starts, because if it starts in 1939, when World War II starts for the British, huge amounts of what would make the Japanese so lethal don't yet exist. I mean, Shikaku and Zuikaku don't exist yet. Yamato Musashi don't exist yet. Well, I mean, they're all on the stocks, but they're years away from coming into service. The Zero doesn't exist. The B5N, kind of just about. The Val doesn't. Albeit, to be fair, the Val's coming in next year. And, the list goes on. The G4M, not yet in service. So, a lot of the stuff that you associate with the Japanese advances and their ability to hit hard just isn't there. Heck, at that point, even the Japanese concept of operating all their carriers together as one big strike formation that we would otherwise perhaps call the Kiru Butai, that doesn't exist either. That's still a couple of years away down the line. So a war in 1939 is going to be a radically different thing to a war in 1941. And of course, a war that breaks out at the end of 1941 without Britain getting involved in a European war is, okay, then all this other stuff that we just talked about the Japanese not having, they now have. But equally, there's a bunch of stuff that the British didn't get because they had to get stuck into World War II, which they would now have. So they almost certainly would have their properly navalized Spitfire-derived single-seat fighter, the one that the RAF basically took away from them at the outbreak of 1939, when the outbreak of World War II. They'd have more of their King George V's in service. They'd have all sorts of additional fun things coming down the line. So it's very difficult to work out what would happen because the strengths and weaknesses of the two sides are, to a certain degree, locked in by when they went to war. Obviously, then the British also have combat experience historically for 2.5 years going up to late 1941, which they theoretically won't have in this scenario if they have war in 1941. And then, it's all a little bit of a mess. So I think we need to define things a little bit more closely. You can look at, say, naval night fighting tactics. The Japanese are very good at night fighting. We cannot take that away from them. Conversely, especially if it's 1941 and the British have had the past couple of years of a peacetime to sort out radar even more in the fleet, the British have radar and they will have some idea how to use it, kind of like you see at Cape Matapan. And it was one of the lesser known events right at the start of the historic outbreak of the Pacific element of World War II. British destroyers go up against Japanese destroyers in night fighting or night attack, where the British destroyers are assigned to get in, sink Japanese troop transports, and then get out. The Japanese are obviously protecting their troop transports with destroyers and so forth. But the British tactics at night end up being able to beat the Japanese tactics at night because they get past the Japanese without being spotted and end up in the area where they could attack the transports if the transports are there. Admittedly, then they're detected on the way out, but that's kind of obvious, you would think. And those are ships that don't even have radar. So who is the better at night fighting? Is it the British? Is it the Japanese? I'd argue on the basis of the evidence and the technological advantage, probably if they're going 1 for 1, or in this case the British have numbers advantage, probably actually the British might do better with night fighting. Now, of course, there are levelers like the Long Lance, which the British won't expect, the rather extensive range of some of the Japanese bombers, because the G3M, the Nell, as opposed to the G4M, the Beatty, is in service even in 1939, and as we know with foresaid, the British genuinely didn't think that Nells and Bettys could reach out that far with torpedoes. And then you have really absurd little bits from history which you can pick up on, like, going to the Indian Ocean raid. At that point, the Japanese, so if we're assuming the war breaking out in late 41, at that point, Japanese carrier doctrine is significantly superior to Royal Navy carrier doctrine, although, once again, we don't know what Royal Navy carrier doctrine and capabilities would be if they were able to go to war in 41 instead of 39, but nonetheless, during the actual Indian Ocean raid, Japanese daylight carrier doctrine is significantly superior to British doctrine, but despite having 5 carriers, plus Tone and Chikuma, and a whole load of scouts, Admiral Nagumo completely fails to find the British carriers, despite the British carriers being 120 miles away, which is, basically spitball range, considering that Midway's fought over more than twice that distance. It's literally the equivalent of an entire fleet sneaking between the American and Japanese fleets, closer to the Japanese fleet than the American, in the middle of the Battle of Midway, and the Japanese don't completely miss it. The flip side is that the British are the only ones with a proper night strike doctrine for their carriers, but they never get a chance to actually test that en masse against an enemy fleet formation during the Second World War, so we don't know exactly how well that would have worked out, but they do have that capability. They can try it, and the Japanese don't really have an answer for it. I think this is a very long way of saying I genuinely don't know. You could stack the deck very much one way or the other by making certain assumptions, but I think for a slightly more coherent, well, not going to say coherent, but slightly more focused answer, we'd have to know, is this war starting in 1939, or is this war starting in 1941, or is this war starting a couple of years later, 1942-43, so that we can establish who's got what and where and how, and from there we can probably derive some idea of how things would go, because as I said, with the rather open-ended question that we have at the moment, there are elements of what the Royal Navy might try or could try that would probably work very well, and there are elements of what the Japanese Navy could or would try that would probably work very well for them, but it's difficult to make specific predictions. I mean, it's the same as like with Operation Sea, even if the Indian Ocean raid, if you look at changing even one or two very, very minor things, suddenly the outcome could be everything from the Kido Butai gets completely wiped out or substantially wiped out, all the way through to Somerville and Force A get completely wiped out, and everything in between. Toreno asks, having watched your Crimean War video, I wonder if there had been a major fleet battle between two navies primarily equipped with steam-powered ships of the line, say Britain and France in the 1850s, how would such a battle play out? Some sources seem to suggest a battle would be much like an Age of Sail battle, but with slightly more advanced tactics and technology, while others suggest an apocalyptic scene of both navies being virtually wiped out with mutual broadsides of explosive shells. Is either scenario likely, or is it somewhere in between? Admittedly, this is a very difficult one to call, but I think we can take some qualified lessons from the Crimean War. Now, obviously, the Crimean War didn't feature any large-scale steamship of the line versus steamship of the line action, but certain elements of what did occur could inform this theoretical fight. I would suggest perhaps that you lean away from the idea of apocalyptic destruction on both sides thanks to explosive shells. As I mentioned during the video on the Crimean War, at least the first one, there's one more from at least one more from me and a collab to come on that. But nonetheless, when we're looking at explosive shells, the Battle of Sinop, people usually go after that. But as I pointed out there, the Russians came with more than enough firepower to completely wreck the Turkish fleet, even if they were just using straight up solid shot weapons. Taking on a bunch of frigates and either very small ships of the line or very large frigates with a bunch of full-on first rates, that's never, ever going to end well for the Ottoman fleet at all, regardless of what ammunition types you're using. Whereas, if you look at something like the Battle of Lissa, actual full-scale ships of the line tend to be slightly more durable. The flip side to that is that in things like the shore bombardments of Sevastopol, that showed that wooden warships faced with red-hot shot and explosive shells were being set on fire and damaged considerably more and considerably faster than they were when they were just flinging cannonballs at each other back at the Battle of Trafalgar, even though these ships were generally bigger and stronger than the ones that you could find at Trafalgar. So, yeah, it's not going to be quite Age of Sail battle, because one of the main things is, with now being able to maneuver independent of the wind with steam, you can maneuver yourself for best advantage rather than having to rely on the vagaries of the climate, albeit still you've got masts and rigging, so even if your sails are furled, there is going to be a certain element of the wind involved with the being on the lee side of the windward, and how your ship's going to roll, how your ship's mostly going to be listing a little bit, and how that might affect your gunnery. But I think you would see a lot more jockeying for position, and possibly in the end they might conclude that no, this jockeying for position isn't going to work out and we'll just settle down for a line action. But given Lissa, given some of the actual tactics that were being talked about at the time, I rather suspect a more Trafalgar-style pell-mell battle is going to be what breaks out, more than just a line action, when both sides have steam power, roughly similar firepower, and are able to maneuver freely. And then where the critical factor is likely to come in that kind of environment is going to be the supporting ships, because you see during the shore bombardments of Sevastopol, some ships get into real difficulties and almost sunk because, as explosions and fire spread, if they're not able to maneuver clear and they start to bog down, then they can be hit more and more and things get worse and worse for them. Whereas one of the big counters to that was literally strapping smaller steam-powered auxiliaries to the unengaged side of the ships and moving them around that way. That made them harder to hit, and it meant that if they did start to get hit worryingly hard anyway, you could quickly haul them out of line. Now, to a certain extent, a steam-powered ship of the line can do that for itself, but I rather suspect that an 1850s steamship of the line fight like that, you're going to have frigates and other auxiliaries off in the wings, and whereas in a Nelsonian-era battle, frigates still did tow damaged ships of the line, it tended to be towards the closing stages of the battle, whereas now, again, able to maneuver under their own power and with a lot more riding on it, I think you will probably see small units of frigates and other auxiliaries darting in to try and rescue and maneuver crippled ships of the line who have otherwise been shot up, because these boilers and everything were quite high. It's entirely possible they would have been damaged in the fighting, and the ship doesn't have any real means of propulsion. And how that's organised in the background, I think, would play a huge factor in the battle. If you've got one side that's essentially treating this like Trafalgar or Sinop, etc., and just going, yeah, we're going to go in and we're going to fight, and eventually one or the other's going to give in, and the other side's gone, well, you know what, we've brought half a dozen frigates with us for scouting purposes, but, frigates, if you do see another ship in danger, one of our ships of the line in a bit of distress, go in and haul it out of the line and give it time to rest, recover, recondition, and get back into the fight, or at least preserve it from being further victimised. Whoever is smart enough to do that will probably win. Phil Kreider asks, could you elaborate a bit on the power density of 2-cycle versus 4-cycle diesel engines? And what did the Japanese Navy use? From what I've been able to tell, some of the earlier Japanese submarines seem to have had two-stroke or two-cycle engines, but the majority of their later stuff seems to have had four-cycle or four-stroke engines. Now, as far as the differences between two-cycle and four-cycle, well, there are quite a few, but broadly speaking, a two-cycle engine is going to be smaller and lighter for a given power output. It's going to be much easier to maintain. It's much simpler. It's going to have less vibration. It's going to be easier to start up. And as we said, it's going to be generally lighter as well. However, it's going to have worse fuel economy, and it's going to produce less torque for a given output. So the advantage of the four-stroke engine is you get more torque, more fuel efficiency, and also in terms of number of operational cycles before something breaks, the four-cycle will last longer. So it's a little bit weird in that the two-cycle is much easier to maintain when it breaks, but it is more likely to break in the first place. The four-stroke is a much more complex engine. If it does break down, you're in trouble, but it's going to take a lot longer for it to break down to start with. The disadvantage of the four-stroke is that for a given weight, it's going to be a significantly less powerful engine, and it's much more expensive. So it is a little bit of a hard one to decide what to do when you're taking a submarine, because obviously for a sub, you have very limited space. So if you've got very limited space and you need a lot of power for your diesels to charge the batteries, run a hybrid drive or whatever, you might initially think our two-stroke engine is great. It's easy to fix, it'll occupy very little space, but also two-stroke engines tend to do better at higher RPM, whereas four-stroke do better at lower RPM, which is more akin to what you're actually going to be using in a sub. And of course, if you're out on patrol, you also have to take into account fuel, and a two-stroke engine will burn through your fuel a lot faster than a four-stroke will. So overall, for submarines, on balance, I would probably take a four-stroke engine on any kind of largish sub. The only time I'd really consider taking a two-stroke would be on something that's a relatively small, like a midget sub, like an X-Craft or something. And apologies if you've been hearing little whines or howls throughout this particular recording of the Drydock, just like then. Floppy the dog is making his displeasure known. It's currently a thunderstorm outside, and he's not a big fan of that. I will be relocating my recording studio, so this shouldn't be a regular feature of the Drydock, but I'm afraid there's no getting around it without me re-recording half of this, which would make recording this an absolute pain. So yeah, a few background growls and moans for this Drydock is what you're going to have to put up with. Sorry about that. Capitano Lorenzo asks, if memory serves, Major Francis John William Harvey VC, British Royal Marine Light Infantry, was commander of Q turret on HMS Lion before the turret was fatally hit by the battlecruiser SMS Lutzow at Jutland. My question is this: Major Harvey's rank at the time of his death was Major of the Royal Marines. How high up in the Royal Marine rank structure could or can a Royal Marine be promoted while serving on a Royal Navy vessel whilst retaining command commensurate with his rank? And taking this to its logical end, hypothetically, can a Royal Marine officer command a Royal Navy capital ship? Has this ever occurred? Now, I'm not entirely versed in Royal Marine law to the same extent as other elements of naval history, but from what I understand, I think a major is about as high as you're going to get within the Royal Marines whilst being in general at-sea service. And I base that largely on the fact that even on a battleship, there might be high tens to maybe just over 100 Royal Marines, if you're lucky. And that's an appropriate command size for a major, but a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, which are the next two ranks up from major, which is what Francis Harvey was, as you can see here. This is him. So lieutenant colonel or colonel should ordinarily be in command of several hundred men, up to 1,000 or so. And you're just not going to get that many Royal Marines on a battleship. I suppose you might get a lieutenant colonel or a colonel of Marines if say somebody wanted to go, okay, well, let's have somebody who's going to be in charge of all the Marines assigned to a particular battleship division, but where exactly they would go, I'm not entirely sure. Again, I'm not sure so much of whether they did this in, let's say, the Grand Fleet or whatever, but I could see it possibly happening. And then once you get beyond that, you're basically going to go ashore, I think. Now, can a Royal Marine officer take command a Royal Navy capital ship? Not normally, no, because the skills and training that a Royal Marine will have had, whilst they are extensive and pretty lethal, are not going to be the same kind of training and skills that a captain in the Royal Navy will have received, and so they wouldn't be deemed to be suitable, even if they were at approximately equivalent rank levels, to formally take command of a Royal Navy ship in anything but the most dire of circumstances. So, if in theory a ship has been battered this way and that, and all the regular senior staff are dead, and the last man standing is a major or captain of the Marines, and there's just a bunch of enlisted, he might, if he's been serving on the ship for a while, he might just say, well, lads, let's get this thing going, and he might temporarily take charge, but it's going to be an absolute outlier and an emergency case, and basically just to take advice from the other people under him to help get the ship to a position where more experienced command crew can be brought in. BFW asks, there's a video from the Australian National Maritime Museum showing HMAS Vampire going to action stations, and he provides a link. Could you provide a walkthrough explanation of roughly who's doing what and why? Some of it's pretty clear as to what they're doing, but things like the actions and orders in the machine spaces are not so much something I could get through intuition. Now, much as I'd like to, there are a couple of things. As you know, I've tried to do a couple of reviews / critiques of movies before and fallen afoul of various rather irritating people who work or bots who work for those companies who have those movies, who do not understand the concept of fair use, do not understand the concept of critique, and fight tooth and nail to have anything negative about their movie kept off of the internet. That's made me very leery of using any sort of anyone else's current modern footage. Now, I'm sure the Australian National Maritime Museum probably wouldn't mind, but I'd rather not run the risk. It's not worth it from my perspective. Now, the thing is, if you've gotten this far, well done. I am, at the time that this releases, due to be going to Australia in just over a month, where I will be seeing HMAS Vampire. So what I could do, by way of compensation, is I can go through that video myself. I'll make some notes as to what they're saying and where, and then I can go aboard Vampire, go to those places, hopefully if they'll let me, and then tell you, right, well, in the little video they've done, at timestamp X, they say X and do Y. This is what they're doing and why. So I can walk you through that, and then that's entirely my content. So if you're happy with that, that's what I will do while I'm in Australia. And on the subject of Australia, that's the last question for this particular Patreon Drydock. Well done. Now, as I said, speaking of Australia, I will be doing a community post with a short video at some point later this coming week to explain a bit further in a bit more detail. And if you're on the Discord server, there is a specific channel set up to discuss the Australia trip with a pinned post there as well. But the long and the short of it is, yep, I'm going to Australia in June. And the only slight issue is that the whole crew, the Canada crew, so myself, Dr. Clark, Gareth and Dan, we are hoping to all go as a team, but travel to Australia is quite expensive, and even internal flights in Australia are quite expensive as compared to going to the USA, from the UK at least, that is. So by way of approximate cost comparison, for what it's going to cost me to go to Australia, I could basically go to the US for So Australia for 2 and a bit weeks. I could go to the US for about 6 to 7 weeks for roughly the same amount of money, or I could go to the US for a couple of weeks, take Mrs. Drac with me, and and then we could go to, I don't know, Disneyland, Universal Studios, or somewhere like that, and splash out for like a whole weekend or something ridiculous like that, and we'd still save money compared to going to Australia. But there's a lot of unique naval history, like a daring class destroyer in Australia, so there's a fairly packed schedule in Australia. There'll be a lot of good content coming out from it, but because of the fact it just does cost a fair bit of money to get there, we have started a crowdfunding campaign to help offset the costs. And as I explain on that crowdfunding campaign website, that we're not asking for the world. We're not asking you to pay for premium hotels and business class airline tickets and all that other nonsense. We're not even actually, strictly speaking, asking you to pay for our entire trip. All we're asking is for people to chip in with some fairly nice rewards, I think, to help offset some of those costs so that we can bring you some of that wonderful naval history content. And if you don't want to, if you just want to sit back and watch the videos that are produced from that trip, that's fine as well. But if you'd like to help out, you might even get to meet me. Some of you already have at various tours, and both in the UK and in the US, but and some of you in Australia will meet me anyway, I'm sure, if you want to show up. But if you want a prolonged and extended conversation about various things, and possibly even the tour of Belfast or Victory or Warrior or something, then, well, that's one of the rewards at the higher tiers, and there's various other things that you can do as well. So I would be grateful if you could, and we shall see how everything goes. But that's all I'm going to say about it for the minute. And aside from that community post and short video that'll come up later this week, that's all I'm going to ask. Because as you probably know, I'm not one of these people who's always singing on about like, favourite, subscribe, join the Patreon, etc., etc. I prefer to let people do that organically if they actually genuinely want to. But of course, with this, I have to actually let you know it's a thing. So there you go. Now you know it's a thing. Thanks very much. Bye.